On a Tuesday morning in August of 1988, Raymond Hollis drove his county extension truck down Birch Creek Road and stopped in the middle of the lane. He had expected to find another stalled operation, another big machine sitting with its hood raised, another farmer on the telephone to a dealer 3 counties away. What he found instead was Harlan Foss, still threshing. Every other wheat operation in Pratt County, Kansas, had shut down 4 days earlier. The Tanner brothers' $347,000 combine sat dead at the end of its headland, a hydraulic line blown open at the fitting. The Ellsworth family's 2 late-model machines were parked side by side on the gravel road, a mechanic's truck between them, hoods raised in the 108-degree air. 12,000 acres of winter wheat stood uncut across the county, and the storm forecast out of Dodge City was saying Friday. But Harlan Foss, 67 years old, was still threshing. And Raymond Hollis, who had called the operation on Birch Creek Road outdated in a county newsletter just 14 months earlier, sat in his truck and watched. Let me tell you about the summer of 1988 in Pratt County, because you need to understand what the modern wheat harvest looked like before you can understand what Harlan did. By the mid-1980s, the custom cutting industry in south-central Kansas had reorganized itself around late-model self-propelled combines. The John Deere 9500 was the machine the county extension office had been recommending for 3 consecutive growing seasons. It cost $182,000 in base configuration. It had a 466 cubic inch 6-cylinder diesel engine rated at 240 horsepower. It had computer-controlled cylinder speed, automated sieve adjustment, and a grain loss monitoring system with sensors positioned at 12 separate points in the separation sequence. It had a pressurized, climate-controlled cab with a tinted wraparound windshield and a seat that adjusted in 7 directions. It could harvest between 40 and 60 acres per day in average Kansas conditions. Raymond Hollis had presented the case for high-capacity modern combines at the Pratt County Farm Bureau meeting in March of 1987. He had brought slides. One slide showed throughput in bushels per hour. One slide showed labor cost per acre. One slide showed a 10-year return on investment analysis. The numbers were clean, and they were compelling. 3 operations in the county had taken out equipment loans that spring based on Hollis's presentation. The Tanner brothers had financed $347,000. The Ellsworth family had financed $310,000 for 2 machines. A younger farmer named Kluge, who was just starting out on rented ground northeast of town, had put $195,000 on a note at 11.5% interest. What Raymond Hollis did not have a slide for was what happened when the temperature in Pratt County hit 107 degrees Fahrenheit for 5 consecutive days in August. On the first day of the heat wave, the Tanner brothers' 9500 ran 12 hours, then through a hydraulic line under the feeder house. The fitting had worked loose under the thermal cycling. The hydraulic fluid running through it was running at 215 degrees, which was 55 degrees above the design temperature for the rubber-lined fitting at that pressure point. The line didn't fail because anything was worn out. The line failed because it was being asked to hold pressure it had never been designed to hold at that temperature. The Tanner brothers called their John Deere dealer in Pratt. The dealer called the regional parts warehouse in Wichita. The fitting was in stock, but the delivery truck didn't run on Tuesday. On the second day, the Ellsworth family's 2 machines both developed what their operator, a young man from Kingman County named Pressel, called rotor choking. The wheat was so dry and brittle in the heat that the straw shattered before it could feed cleanly through the cylinder. The shattered material packed against the concave and stopped the rotor. Clearing a rotor choke required shutting the machine down, waiting for the cylinder to coast to a stop, then manually pulling the packed material out by hand through the access panel, a process that took between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on how badly the material had compressed. In 104-degree heat, with the steel housing of the machine radiating additional warmth, Pressel had to stop 6 times on the second day and 4 times on the third. On the third day, the replacement hydraulic fitting arrived at the Tanner Brothers from Wichita, and it was the wrong thread pitch, metric instead of standard. The dealer had pulled the wrong part number. The correct fitting had to be ordered from a secondary warehouse in Kansas City. 3 to 5 business days, maybe 4. On the 4th day, the National Weather Service office in Dodge City issued an advisory. A low-pressure system forming over the Colorado Rockies was tracking east-northeast and was likely to reach south-central Kansas by Friday evening. Winds 40 to 65 miles per hour, hail possible. Wheat that was standing and fully ripe at that wind speed would shatter and drop. Losses on uncut mature wheat in a windstorm of that magnitude typically ran between 40 and 70% of the crop's value. There was no recovery from a loss of that kind. You did not get to harvest grain that had already blown out of the head and into the dirt. The county extension office began receiving calls it didn't know how to answer. Raymond Hollis got in his truck and drove down Birch Creek Road to see if there was anything he could do. That is when he saw Harlan Foss. That's when an old 1924 Advance Rumely threshing rig appeared across the rise, moving through the standing wheat at 3.5 miles per hour, as though the temperature were of no concern to it whatsoever. Let me tell you about Harlan Foss, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Harlan was 67 years old in the summer of 1988. He had farmed the same 440 acres on Birch Creek Road since 1954, when he came back from 2 years working the oil fields near Elk City, Oklahoma, with enough cash to take over the note on his father's land. He had never hired custom cutters. He had never carried an operating loan at the bank. In 34 years of farming, he had paid cash for every piece of equipment he owned, which meant he had bought very little and maintained what he had for a very long time. Harlan was not a man who attended Farm Bureau presentations. He was not a man who went to the John Deere Dealer Appreciation Nights or the Pioneer Seed Corn Dinners at the American Legion Hall in Pratt. He was not a man who drove to town for reasons that didn't require driving to town. He was a man who understood, with the particular clarity that comes from working the same ground for 3 decades, that wheat harvest in south-central Kansas is not a moderate weather event. It is a 5-day window at the end of a 10-month investment. Everything that happens in that window is determined by what you prepared in the months before it. He had been preparing since March. Let me tell you about the threshing rig, because it is the true heart of this story. The machine was a 1924 Advance Rumely Oil Pull Model E, serial number 14398, built at the Rumely Products Company factory in LaPorte, Indiana, in the same year that Calvin Coolidge won the presidential election. A first-class stamp cost 2 cents, and a good milk cow could be had at auction in Pratt County for $47. The oil pull was not a steam engine, though it looked like something from that era. It burned kerosene, a cheaper, heavier fuel than gasoline, through a two-cylinder, horizontally opposed engine mounted low in the frame. The engine drove a flat belt pulley at the rear. That belt ran back 60 feet across the stubble field to a 1929 case threshing machine that Harlan's father had bought used in 1941 for $210, and that Harlan had fully rebuilt twice in the intervening years. The oil pull had earned its name from the way Rumely engineered its cooling system. In an era when most internal combustion engines used water and a radiator, Rumely circulated oil through the engine block and expelled the heat through a distinctive finned cooling tower mounted above the engine, taller than the operator's head, almost architectural in its proportions. From a mile away, the oil pull's silhouette was unlike anything else on a Kansas road. It looked less like a farm tractor than like a small industrial furnace that had learned to move. Harlan's grandfather had purchased the machine new in the spring of 1925, paying $1,840 for it at the implement dealer in Pratt. His grandfather's neighbor, a man named Vaught, who farmed the section to the south, had laughed at the purchase. Vaught was buying horses, better horses, more horses. That was where a man's money belonged. The steam threshermen were going out of business, and this newfangled kerosene equipment was going with them. What the country needed was good horseflesh and a reliable binder, and patience. Vaught sold his last team in 1931. He bought a used farmall on credit and was behind on the payment by 1933. The oil pull kept running. Harlan's father had run the threshing rig through the 1930s and 1940s, not only for his own harvest, but as a custom thresherman for 5 neighboring operations, charging 10 cents per bushel. During the war years, when new equipment was simply unavailable and gasoline was rationed, the oil pull's ability to run on kerosene, more consistently available in rural Kansas than gasoline, made it the most important piece of agricultural machinery in a 20-mile radius. Neighbors who had laughed at the machine in 1925 were paying Harlan's father to run it in 1944. When Harlan took over in 1954, the oil pull was 30 years old. Every implement dealer and county agent he knew advised him to sell it. The self-propelled combine was the future. The era of the threshing crew, the separator, the bundle wagon, the grain wagon, the water boy, was finished. A man could buy a used Massey Harris 21 for $1,100 and do his own cutting without a crew. The old rigs were becoming curiosities. In 10 years, they'd be museum pieces. Harlan did not sell the oil pull. In 1961, he had the engine rebored by a machinist in Hutchinson named Klepper, who still understood the tolerances of the old Rumely design. He had the cylinder liners replaced with machined iron sleeves. He had the oil cooling tower refitted with new fin material by a sheet metal fabricator in Wichita, who normally built grain elevator equipment, and who told Harlan 3 times that the job wasn't worth doing. Harlan paid him and drove the rig home. In 1974, when the fuel oil price spike made kerosene suddenly expensive, Harlan converted the oil pull to run on a blended fuel, 70% kerosene, 30% number 2 fuel oil, that his nephew worked out after studying the carburetor's metering needle. The conversion cost $140 in parts and 3 weekends of work. It reduced fuel cost per acre by 22%. In 1981, he replaced the main bearing on the belt pulley shaft. He ordered the bearing from an agricultural machinery parts supplier in Salina, who found it in a warehouse catalog and seemed genuinely surprised that anyone still needed one. The bearing cost $34. Harlan installed it himself in an afternoon. By the summer of 1988, the oil pull was 64 years old. It had run, by Harlan's log, in every harvest since 1925, with the exception of 1936, when a grasshopper infestation destroyed the crop before it could be cut. It had never needed a dealer. It had never needed a computer. It had never needed a technician with a diagnostic scanner. It needed kerosene, oil, a patient operator, and someone who understood it well enough to replace what wore out before it failed. Harlan understood it very well. The nickname came out of a meeting of the Pratt County Production Agriculture Committee in the spring of 1986. Raymond Hollis was presenting on harvest efficiency metrics across county operations. He had assembled cost per bushel data from 16 farms, and he had organized the table from lowest cost at the top to highest cost at the bottom. One entry at the lower end of the table, high cost, low throughput by modern standards, represented a 440-acre winter wheat operation on Birch Creek Road. Hollis didn't identify the farm by name. He didn't need to. The man who spoke was Gerald Tanner, senior of the Tanner Brothers operation, who farmed 2,200 acres south of town and had a talent for the remark that landed and stayed. He said it quietly, almost to himself, but the room at the county extension office held 22 people, and the ceiling was low. That would be the Rumely Relic. A few men laughed, a few didn't. Raymond Hollis looked at his slides. The names spread the way those names do in small counties, not through newspapers at first, but through coffee shop booths and tailgate conversations, and the particular efficiency of rural telephone lines. Within 2 weeks, it had made a circuit through the 3 townships north and south of Pratt, and arrived, inevitably, at the Farm Bureau Hall, where someone repeated it to someone, who repeated it to someone who worked at the Pratt Tribune, and a columnist used it in a piece about modernizing county agriculture. The column was not unkind. It acknowledged that Harlan Foss was a skilled farmer who had managed his land without debt for 30 years. It described the oil pull as a remarkable piece of mechanical history. It concluded by suggesting, gently, that remarkable mechanical history and profitable modern agriculture were not entirely compatible categories. Raymond Hollis read the column and did not write a letter to the editor. Harlan Foss heard the name from his nephew, who drove out to tell him about the column. Harlan listened to the full account without interrupting. When his nephew finished, Harlan nodded once. Then he went out to the machine shed and checked the timing on the oil pull's ignition, which had been running a half-degree retarded since October, and which he had been meaning to correct since December. He corrected it. He started the engine, listened to it for 2 minutes, and shut it back down. The timing was right. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever maintained something that everyone told you to replace? Not because you couldn't afford the new thing, but because you understood the old thing well enough to know it still had more to give? Have you ever stood in a room where people were making decisions about your operation based on a slide presentation, and known that the slide presentation was missing the one variable that actually mattered? Have you ever been right in a way you couldn't demonstrate until the conditions were exactly wrong for everything else? Harlan Foss had that kind of certainty in August of 1988, when the heat index in Pratt County reached 110 degrees, and he walked out to the machine shed at 5:30 a.m., checked the oil level in the oil pull's cooling tower, found it correct, and started the engine. He had that certainty as he drove the rig out to the edge of his wheat at first light and engaged the separator. He hadn't needed a name for what he knew. He had needed 64 years of someone maintaining the machine that carried it. There is a reason the oil pull kept running when the modern combines couldn't, and it is worth understanding completely, because it explains everything that happened on Birch Creek Road that week. When Raymond Hollis stopped his truck that Tuesday morning and walked to the fence line, Harlan brought the rig to idle. It was the first extended conversation the two men had ever had. Hollis was 39 years old and had a degree in agricultural economics from Kansas State. Harlan was 67 and had learned what he knew from the land, the machine, and 43 harvest seasons. Hollis asked what was keeping the oil pull running when everything else had stopped. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who explained himself quickly. Then he said, "This engine doesn't fight the heat. It's built to run in it." What he meant, and what Hollis spent 3 evenings researching at the Pratt County Library before he fully understood, was this. Every internal combustion engine has what engineers call a thermal design point, the temperature range at which the engine reaches its optimal combustion efficiency. Modern diesel engines and agricultural combines are designed with a thermal envelope centered around 75 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit ambient temperature. Their cooling systems, liquid-cooled, radiator-based, with electric fans and thermostat-controlled flow, are sized precisely for that range. At those temperatures, the fuel-to-air mixture, the combustion timing, and the hydraulic fluid viscosity all operate within their specified parameters. At 107 degrees ambient, with the hydraulic fluid running at 50 to 70 degrees above its rated operating temperature, and the electronics generating heat of their own, those machines were no longer operating within their designed parameters. The hydraulic line that failed on the Tanner Brothers machine did not fail because it was defective. It failed because the hydraulic oil running through it was at 215 degrees, and the fitting had been rated for 300 pounds per square inch at 160 degrees. At 215 degrees, the same fitting was good for perhaps 190 pounds per square inch. It was holding 270. The math was simple, and the consequence was inevitable. The oil pull's design logic was the inverse. Rumely's engineers in LaPorte in 1924 did not have the option of electrically modulated cooling systems or precision-controlled fuel injection. They had to build an engine that would run in Kansas in August in the hands of a farmer who might not have a parts dealer within 40 miles. They built it to run hot, intentionally, by design. The oil cooling tower maintained the engine block at approximately 220 degrees Fahrenheit under full load. At that temperature, kerosene, a heavier, slower-burning fuel than gasoline with a higher flash point, vaporized more completely than it would in a cooler engine. More complete vaporization produced more complete combustion. More complete combustion produced more torque from each firing cycle at lower RPM. On a 107-degree August morning in Pratt County, the oil pull was operating close to its design conditions. The ambient heat was not stressing the system. It was, in the most literal engineering sense, helping the fuel burn. Hollis had studied agricultural mechanization for 15 years. He had never encountered the oil pull's thermal design in any modern curriculum, because the modern curriculum did not cover machines that hadn't been manufactured since 1931. "That's the whole thing," Harlan said. "People think the heat is the problem. For this machine, the heat is part of the answer." He put the oil pull back in gear. "Let me explain one more layer, because it is the foundation on which everything else in this story rests. The Advanced Rumely Oil Pulls oil cooling system was not simply a different way to accomplish the same goal as water cooling. It was a fundamentally different engineering philosophy. Water-cooled systems remove heat from the engine as quickly as possible to keep it within a narrow, comfortable band. Oil-cooled systems, as Rumely implemented them, managed heat, retained some, expelled some, and used the retained heat as a thermodynamic asset. The oil circulated through the block, not to cool it to a target temperature, but to stabilize it at a higher, more combustion-efficient temperature. In moderate or cool conditions, this design was merely adequate. In extreme summer heat, on a harvest day, when every other machine on the road was fighting to keep its temperature down, this design was something else entirely. It was exactly what had been intended 64 years earlier by men who knew what Kansas in August actually meant. Let me tell you about the morning Gerald Tanner came to Birch Creek Road, because that is when the real accounting started. He came on Wednesday. He brought Raymond Hollis with him. The Tanner brothers had made their calls the night before. The John Deere dealer in Pratt had confirmed the correct hydraulic fitting was now, at minimum, 4 days out, possibly 5. There had been a confusion at the secondary warehouse, and the reorder had to go to Kansas City. The storm forecast had accelerated. The National Weather Service was now calling for the front to arrive Friday evening, possibly Friday afternoon. Gerald Tanner had done the arithmetic on his standing wheat and arrived at a number he did not want to say out loud, which was approximately $47,000 in potential storm losses if the crop was still standing when the wind arrived. He had not wanted to drive down Birch Creek Road. He was the man who had made the remark at the Production Agriculture Committee meeting. He was the man whose words had put the Rumely Relic into the county's vocabulary. He was the man who had financed $347,000 in equipment that was presently parked at the end of a field with a blown hydraulic line, waiting on a fitting from Kansas City. But a man with $47,000 standing in the wind learns to drive down roads he'd prefer not to drive down. They heard the oil pull before they crested the rise, the sound carried up from the creek bottom. Not the high-frequency turbine whine of a modern combine, not the diesel clatter of a tractor pulling a header, but something lower and older and more deliberate. A rhythmic exhalation, each power stroke separate and distinct, like the breathing of something large and patient that had been breathing for a very long time and had not given it much thought. It was the sound of a machine that was not working hard. It was the sound of a machine that had been built precisely for this. Then they came over the rise, and they saw it. The oil pull moved through the standing wheat at 3.5 miles per hour, its tall oil cooling tower wavering slightly above the heat shimmer coming off the field. The flat belt ran back from the tractor's rear pulley, 60 feet of vulcanized rubber in constant synchronized motion, transmitting power to the case thresher that worked behind it. The thresher shook and vibrated as wheat went in one end and emerged as separated grain, clean straw, and chaff, each stream going to its designated destination with a mechanical efficiency that had not changed in 60 years. The grain auger cycled steadily. The straw blower launched a gold arc into the wagon. Harlan's hired man, a young man from Harper County named Dietz, managed the grain wagon without apparent hurry. Nothing looked fast. Nothing looked modern. The entire operation had the quality of something that had found its pace long ago and saw no reason to alter it. Gerald Tanner stood at the fence line and did not speak for a long time. Hollis stood beside him and also did not speak. The oil pull made its turn at the headland. The engine note shifted slightly as the load changed, deeper on the turn, steadier on the straight. And then it was back in the wheat, and the belt was running, and the thresher was working, and the straw arc was climbing again. "That machine hasn't stopped," Hollis said. He wasn't saying it to Tanner. He was working something out. "No," Tanner said. "It hasn't." It was not the observation Harlan had been waiting for. He hadn't been waiting for any observation. He was watching where the header was taking the crop. Gerald Tanner asked Raymond Hollis to go speak to Harlan. Tanner himself stayed at the fence. He was not, he said, the right man for the conversation. Hollis walked across the stubble and waited at the end of a pass. When Harlan brought the rig to idle at the headland, Hollis came forward. He explained the situation plainly: the fitting, the timeline, the forecast, the 2,200 acres, the Friday window. He did not make any reference to the county newsletter, or the Production Agriculture Committee meeting, or the Rumely Relic. He stated facts. Harlan listened to the whole account. He looked at the horizon to the west, which was the habit of every wheat farmer in that county in August. He looked at the oil pull's fuel gauge. "What's he paying custom cutters this year?" he said. Hollis told him. It was 27 cents per bushel, the going county rate. Harlan thought about something for a moment. "I'll do it for 18 cents, same as my grandfather charged in 1938. Hollis opened his mouth and then closed it. He was calculating. At 18 cents per bushel on 2,200 acres, at an average yield of 38 bushels per acre, Tanner would owe Harlan approximately $15,000 for the custom work. Given the storm forecast and the alternative, losing 40 to 65% of 2,200 acres at the current wheat price, the calculation was not difficult. "He'll want to know if you can get it done before Friday," Hollis said. "I'll finish my own place first," Harlan said. "Then I'll come over, and we'll see how far we get." Hollis looked at the field remaining, looked at the oil pull, looked at the sky. "All right," he said. He walked back to the fence. Tanner was watching him come. When Hollis reached him and described the terms, Tanner was quiet for a moment. He had been expecting to negotiate. 18 cents, Tanner said. "That's what he said." Tanner watched the oil pull working its way down the row. "Fine," he said. "Tell him fine." Let me tell you about the 4 days that followed, because no account of what happened on Birch Creek Road in August of 1988 makes sense without understanding the specific arithmetic of those 4 days. Harlan finished his own 440 acres on Thursday morning at 11:15 a.m. He shut the oil pull down, walked around the machine checking the oil level in the cooling tower, the tension on the flat belt, the packing on the cylinder bearings. He found one item that needed attention, a small leak at the water pump seal on the case thresher. Not serious, but worth correcting before moving to a new location. He corrected it. The repair took 40 minutes and cost nothing because the packing material was in a coffee tin on the shelf in the machine shed, where it had been since 1979. He refueled the oil pull from the kerosene drum he kept near the machine shed door. He ate lunch. At 1:30 p.m. Thursday, he and Dietz moved the rig the 12 miles to the Tanner property. The oil pull traveled the county road at 8 miles per hour. Dietz drove the truck and flatbed behind it. They arrived at the Tanner field at approximately 2:15. Gerald Tanner was there to meet them. He did not say much. He showed Harlan the field layout, the location of the grain elevator wagon, and where the auger wagon was parked. He showed Harlan the standing wheat, which was bone dry and ripe, and in some sections already beginning to shatter at the heads from the heat alone. Harlan looked at the field for a while. He looked at the sky to the west. He looked at the oil pull. "Let's get started," he said. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the flat belt began to move. The case thresher shuddered as the drive engaged, a deep vibration that traveled through the frame and into the ground, the mechanical equivalent of a held breath released. The cylinder came up to speed. The sieves began their lateral oscillation. The straw walkers began their cycling motion. The grain auger started turning. And then the oil pull moved into the standing wheat, and the machine began to do what it had been doing, in one form or another, since Harlan's grandfather drove it out of the implement dealer's yard in the spring of 1925. It was not fast. By the standard of a modern combine running in good conditions, it was not fast at all. But it was steady. The oil pull moved through the wheat at 3.5 miles per hour, and it did not slow down, and it did not stop, and it did not wait for parts from Kansas City. The oil cooling tower stood tall above the heat shimmer. The engine note was unchanged from the first pass to the last. The flat belt ran true. Gerald Tanner stayed in the field for the first 2 hours. He watched without speaking. Raymond Hollis came out in the late afternoon and stayed until the light failed. Neither man had seen a threshing rig work a field in anything close to living memory. What they were watching was not museum history. It was functional, active, present-tense agriculture. Slower than modern, but operational, which at 107 degrees on a Wednesday afternoon in a county full of broken machines was the only category that mattered. By sundown Thursday, the oil pull had cut 320 acres of Tanner wheat. Harlan shut the machine down, checked the oil level and the belt tension, refueled from the Tanner's kerosene supply, and went home. He was back at first light Friday. The forecast had moved again. The storm was now projected to arrive between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. Friday evening. The National Weather Service had upgraded its wind estimate to 55 to 65 miles per hour, with hail up to 1-inch diameter possible in the southern tier of the county. The hail estimate was the piece that changed the calculus. Hail at 1 inch on standing wheat did not merely shatter grain from the heads, it flattened the stalks. Flattened stalks were nearly impossible to pick up cleanly with any header. What the hail didn't destroy, the combining losses on downcrop wheat would finish. Harlan did not listen to the forecast. He had looked at the sky before he left home, and he knew what was coming. He started the oil pull at 5:45 a.m. and drove it into the Tanner wheat before the sun cleared the tree line to the east. He ran 12 hours Friday. The heat was 109 degrees at 2 p.m. The oil cooling tower did not vary in its performance. The two-cylinder engine ran at its characteristic 220-degree operating temperature, warm to the hand at the cooling fins, steady in its rhythm, burning kerosene at its designed rate and converting it to torque with the mechanical patience of something that had been doing exactly this work since the Coolidge administration. By 6 p.m. Friday, the oil pull had worked 540 acres of Tanner wheat since arriving Thursday afternoon, 860 acres total, counting the 320 from the previous day. At 6:15 p.m., Raymond Hollis drove out to the field and parked. He walked to where Harlan had brought the rig to idle for a routine belt tension check. "Storm's gonna hit in 2 hours," Hollis said. "Maybe less." Harlan looked at the remaining Tanner wheat. He looked at the sky to the west, which had gone the particular orange-gray color that southwest Kansas residents learned to recognize as young children and never forget as adults. He looked at the oil pull. "I know," he said. He tightened the belt idler, walked back to the operator's position, and put the machine back in gear. At 8:22 p.m., with the wind already picking up from the southwest and the first lightning visible on the horizon, Harlan brought the oil pull to a stop at the headland. He shut the engine down. He walked around the machine one time in the dark, checking by touch. Then he walked to where Dietz was securing the grain wagon and said they were done for the night. Behind them, in the field, approximately 1,340 acres of Tanner wheat still stood uncut. The storm arrived at 8:55 p.m. Let me tell you about what followed, because the numbers are the proof. And in Pratt County, in the fall of 1988, people needed proof. The storm on Friday evening brought 58-mile-per-hour sustained winds and hail up to 1-inch diameter across a corridor running northeast from the Oklahoma border through the center of Pratt County. The standing wheat that had not been cut sustained losses ranging from 43% to 71% of the harvestable yield, depending on field location and soil type. The 860 acres of Tanner wheat that Harlan had cut and threshed before the storm, 440 acres Thursday afternoon and evening, 420 acres Friday, were safe. The grain was in the elevator. At that year's wheat price, those 860 acres represented approximately $72,000 in revenue for the Tanner brothers. The remaining 1,340 acres, the acres the oil pull had not reached, lost an estimated $58,000 to storm damage. Gerald Tanner paid Harlan's bill within a week. The check was written for $15,400, 860 acres at 38 bushels per acre at 18 cents per bushel, which Tanner rounded up. He drove it out to Birch Creek Road himself and handed it to Harlan at the machine shed door. He did not make a speech. He handed Harlan the check, and they looked at the oil pull for a moment, and then Tanner said he needed to be getting back. Harlan said that was fine. Raymond Hollis published an account of the harvest incident in the October 1988 issue of the Pratt County Extension Service newsletter. The piece was 4 paragraphs. It described the oil pull's oil cooling system design and its thermal advantages in extreme ambient temperatures. It described the kerosene engine's combustion efficiency at high operating temperatures. It described the cost differential between Harlan's 18-cent per bushel custom rate and the going county rate of 27 cents. It noted that the Tanner brothers' $347,000 combine, once repaired, would presumably return to service in the 1989 season, and that the oil pull had performed its work without any part that required ordering. He did not use the phrase "Rumely Relic" in the newsletter. Nobody who read the piece commented on its absence. It was simply not there. In the harvest season of 1989, 4 Pratt County operations contracted with Harlan for custom threshing. 2 of them were operations that had previously relied entirely on modern combines. One was the Ellsworth family. The other was a younger farmer named Klug, who had been paying 11.5% interest on his equipment note and had looked carefully at the arithmetic of 18 cents per bushel versus debt service since the previous August. Harlan had not sought the work. He had not made any calls. He had not attended any meetings or given any presentations. He had gone home after the 1988 harvest, checked the oil level in the oil pole's cooling tower, adjusted the tension on the flat belt, and put the machine under the shed roof where it had spent every winter since 1925. In 1991, a writer from TheQuietFarmer magazine drove down Birch Creek Road for a feature. The article was titled, "The Last Thresherman in Kansas." Harlan told the writer the title was inaccurate and cited 3 other active threshing operations in the state. The magazine ran the title anyway. The article generated more reader mail than any feature the publication had run that year. Most of it came from men in their 60s and 70s who had grown up on threshing crews and wanted to put something on the record about the machines and the work and the particular conditions of a Kansas harvest that a person who had never done it could not entirely understand from the outside. Some of it came from younger farmers who had questions about kerosene engine maintenance. Some of it came from engineers. Raymond Hollis read the TheQuietFarmer article in his office at the county extension building. He read it twice. He clipped it and put it in a file he kept on the Pratt County operations he found instructive. The file on Harlan Foss was the thickest one in the cabinet. Harlan didn't read the article. His nephew brought it out to the farm and read sections of it to him while they were checking the bearing on the Case thresher's main drive shaft, which had developed a faint vibration in the 1990 season that Harlan wanted to address before it became something worse. When the nephew finished reading, Harlan listened to the bearing for a moment. "It's the inner race," he said. "We'll need to pull it." The oil pole stood in the shed behind them, cooling tower in the afternoon light, fuel tank full, oil level correct. It was ready for the morning. This story draws from real agricultural history in south-central Kansas and the broader Great Plains threshing era. The Advance Rumely oil pull was a genuine product of the Rumely Products Company of LaPorte, Indiana, widely used in wheat-growing regions from roughly 1910 through the early 1940s. The oil pull's oil cooling system and its thermodynamic design principles are accurately described. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes. Did your family ever run a threshing crew? Do you remember what it was like to work the bundle wagon or follow the straw blower in August heat? The sound of the separator, the smell of cut wheat and kerosene, and the particular exhaustion at the end of a 12-hour day? Tell us in the comments.